71 in sunshine. Next news 8:30. Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560. The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. All right, so here's the thesis of a commentary I did for my counterculture podcast over at American Greatness. amgreatness.com if you want to subscribe and consume it. Here's the thesis, though. See if you agree. So with both the former president and the current first son being convicted felons, the advantage goes to Biden. Yeah. Because here's what you have. A sorrowful father accepts his son's conviction because no one is above the law. Another tragic chapter for a family who has endured so much, the D.C. press corps will report. Like so many families, the big guy worries only about his son's well-being and prays Hunter continues to stave off his addiction demons, the D.C. press corps will report, characterizing Joe as a doting father who just loves his son and is thus worthy of our empathy. Hunter's legal wranglings ironically serve as a tourniquet to stop the Biden crime family from bleeding over onto Joe. The spineless caucus of House Republicans continues to block articles of impeachment against the president, so Biden gets a pass. Meanwhile, Trump doesn't accept the Manhattan jury verdict. He is cast as someone who believes himself to be above the law, which is a tell as to his authoritarian impulses. He's an unlikable cad who got caught, blames everyone but himself, and in fact, we should live in fear of a Trump planet, which must be prevented at all costs. That's what the D.C. press corps will report.
And they have pointed out a number of times this week that the justice system is not corrupt. See, look, Hunter Biden's not above the law.
So the lawfare hasn't worked out quite like the Biden hillbillies conceived it. It's worked out better, actually. The grotesqueness of Fani Willis, the Lavrentry-Beria nature of Jack Smith, the weakness of the witnesses against Trump in Manhattan all blunted the political impact desired by Biden. Yes, that's true. But the convictions have slowed Trump's momentum, and we're only at the beginning of a $500 million worth of a media barrage designed to engineer the next moral panic, which is, say it with me, we can't have a convicted felon in the Oval Office. And that will be directed to an electorate, or at least cohorts within the electorate, that are socialized to give the system the benefit of the doubt and to subscribe to aphorisms like, no one is above the law. And that's why, if that's the competing narratives that are presented, Biden gains at least a slight advantage, and in states that may likely be decided by a few thousand votes again, a slight advantage is a big deal. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And even, that is very well written, by the way. Where can we find that again?
American Greatness. amgreatness.com.
amgreatness.com.
For more on this, see if our next guest agrees. Ben Weingarten is editor-at-large for RealClearInvestigation's.com, senior contributor to The Federalist as well, and he writes at his Substack, Weingarten.substack.com. Ben Weingarten, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Do you agree that the two convictions, at least from a narrative perspective, advantage Biden at present?
I think on their face, to your point about, first of all, making the story about a president's love for his son and tugging at the heartstrings, and this fraudulent notion that, now suddenly we have an impartial and independent, objective legal system in this country that will even prosecute the president's son. On its face, I think that narrative is a powerful one superficially. And the question is really going to be, does it wash with the American people versus the counter narrative, which is that the notion we have a two-tier justice system is an absolute fraud, and we can systematically eviscerate that narrative by pointing to a few very clear, concise points and turn it around on them to say that actually it's a convicted felon, so-called, who is fighting to restore the rule of law on behalf of a hyper-politicized and weaponized justice system that's targeting more than 50% of this country for their beliefs.
So what is that? What does that count? I mean, that's the top line of the counter, but then how do you drive home that point? Because there's a lot of choices from which to select. So what would you say to try to persuade people that all of this sort of schoolhouse rock, we have to accept the jury's verdict and give the system the benefit of the doubt is no longer applicable, because that's moving a lot of people who operate at a very superficial level.
Sure. So one of the main points that I would assert is that, on the one hand, when it comes to President Trump in particular, let's take the New York case, so-called, for example, they had to concoct a crime where you can't even explain what the underlying offenses are that turned a misdemeanor into a felony in a place where felonies routinely become misdemeanors, prosecuting a former president and leading presidential candidate, something never before done, something that the prosecutor himself did not want to do until people left his office and wrote a tell-all book about it. And it's almost inexplicable, again, what the actual offenses are. And the defendant there didn't even know what the underlying predicate so-called crimes were right up until closing arguments, which he didn't even have a chance to rebut, in a 90% Democrat jury pool place with a judge who contributed to Joe Biden. And obviously we can go on and on. But the important point is, contrast that with the Hunter Biden case, where they had to ignore a slew of offenses to get to gun charges at furthest remove from the actual illicit conduct that impacts the national security and really the sanctity of our entire government and republic, namely that Hunter Biden was the bagman for an international influence peddling scheme. And the only reason that prosecution in Delaware happened, and this is the point I wrote about in the New York Post, and I've been trying to hammer this point home, and I've been happy to see others adopt it, is there would be no Delaware Hunter Biden case had not IRS whistleblowers come forward to assert that the Justice Department was tanking the investigation and prosecution into Hunter Biden. Only after the whistleblowers came forward did the DOJ rush to concoct a sweetheart plea deal with Hunter Biden, which collapsed under the most basic line of questioning from Judge Noreika in Delaware. And only after that collapse was the DOJ then forced to save face to bring charges against Hunter Biden. But what charges did they bring? They had already let the statutes of limitation lapse on the most serious misconduct relating to selling out the country, primarily to Ukraine, while Joe Biden was managing the Ukraine portfolio as vice president. The gun charges were at furthest removed. They have nothing to do with international influence peddling. They did bring also the tax evasion offenses in Los Angeles, which is a much more material and serious case where there is exposure potentially to Joe Biden. However, let's note, tax evasion, that's not being an unregistered foreign agent on behalf of a slew of corrupt or adversarial powers. They brought the tax evasion charges. Tax evasion of what? Evasion of taxes on ill-gotten gains from an international influence peddling scheme. But that's not what the charges reflect. Joe Biden's name does not appear in that Los Angeles indictment, despite the fact that all of those ill-gotten gains come from monetizing Joe Biden's name and office. So the DOJ prosecutions, so-called, relating to Hunter Biden are really part of the cover-up of the Biden family international influence peddling scheme, and then of the DOJ's effort to cover up and tank any investigation and prosecution into that scheme.
Is there any possibility, though, that during the tax evasion case, they weren't trying to get access? These foreign, dignitaries weren't trying to get access to Biden, but they're trying to get access to Obama?
It certainly wouldn't surprise me. If you look, it seems, and you have to take each of the different countries and individuals that Hunter Biden was quote unquote working for, even though they can't really point to any services rendered. But in the case of the Chinese national, for example, he was concerned about being prosecuted, and it seems like he wanted to get dirt from Hunter Biden and others on what was the U.S. government considering pursuing him for, et cetera. With respect to Burisma and Ukraine, look, the buck stops with the commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief was Barack Obama. Why did Barack Obama outsource the Ukraine portfolio or the China portfolio to Joe Biden? No one's even ever asked Barack Obama about it. So he's insulated himself in some ways, just like Joe Biden insulated himself by having his family run the business and him serving as sort of the quote-unquote silent partner in this operation. But I think, the important point to remember in all of this to me is that they had to concoct crimes to try and get Donald Trump, just like they pursued parents who were concerned about their kids being indoctrinated in cultural Marxism in school, sicking the FBI on them, just like they put out threat memos from DHS saying, people who have questions about COVID-19 draconian lockdown measures and vaccine efficacy, there's a nexus between them and domestic terrorism. And then, of course, the J6ers, treating them as equivalent to domestic terrorists and sicking counterterrorism authorities on them. All of it points in one way, which is if you disagree with the regime, they're going to claim there's a nexus between that and violent extremism or attacks on democracy, and they're going to put the entire lawfare apparatus at your throat. And on the other hand, the only reason these Hunter Biden cases came is because the DOJ got exposed for tanking and covering it up, and their hand was forced. That's the only reason we're here. That's the only leg they can stand on of, no, actually, there's an equivalent justice system. Of course, again, by the way, Merrick Garland is not going to hold himself in criminal contempt and accept a criminal referral, while on the other hand, you have Steve Bannon, who's going to languish in prison, and you have Peter Navarro, who is languishing in prison today.
So it seems to me we need to boil this detailed knowledge down into aphorisms that are consumable for the superficial voter. And so, for example, the line that you heard all week, this prosecution wouldn't have even been brought if it wasn't Hunter Biden, if it was just an ordinary citizen. And in point of fact, the response would be, per what you were just suggesting, actually, the prosecution wouldn't have happened if IRS whistleblowers didn't come forward against Hunter Biden. That's actually how you have to view it. And with respect to Trump, it's sort of simple, and you can go into those details. It's just, in this country, we don't put our political opponents in prison because they're our political opponents. And that's what the other side has attempted to do, or is attempting to do, because it's happening in real time. With Trump, it seems like we have to sort of, make these complicated machinations more easily understood.
And it's obviously difficult and in the weeds, which is part of the genius of the lawfare offensive. But I think the simple point to make is, if you're going to prosecute someone who's a political figure, you better have them dead to rights on a crime that everyone can understand, and that's very clear. And there's something called prosecutorial discretion. If you want to protect the rule of law in this country, you have to have the appearance of propriety, and there actually has to be propriety. You don't pursue someone on charges that you can't even state, and you can't even explain what the case is. You certainly don't bring those charges a year out from a presidential election while the person is leading in the field. And all of that stinks on its face, even before you get to the demerits of the case and the politicized nature of the judge and the fact that he rigged the case in a million different ways against Donald Trump. In this country, we don't prosecute political figures, and if we are going to prosecute political figures, you better be damn sure that it's a crime that everyone can understand and everyone can agree is awful and shouldn't be acceptable in this system. And instead, they are inventing crimes to go after political figures in the throes of an election. And also, by the way, even prosecuting lawyers who would dare provide defenses for those figures. Because as I'm sure you're well aware, and your listeners are well aware, there's this thing, the 65 Project, where you have left-wing lawfare apparatus prosecuting and seeking to disbar and destroy any and every lawyer who dared represent Donald Trump in election challenges in 2020. They are ruining those lawyers' lives so that there is no one to defend conservatives going forward.
Ben Weingarten, editor-at-large for RealClearInvestigation's.com, senior contributor to The Federalist, and you can get his writings and reporting at weingarten.substack.com as well. Ben Weingarten, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
What Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
Is your company prepared for an emergency? Are your employees trained in CPR? Would they know what to do if another employee needed basic first aid? Or worse yet,